I rolled into Bishop just a couple days before Mule Day weekend, and it was already crazy. I did get to come down the beautiful Highway 6, come the back way into Bishop. I'd always come up from Southern California on 395. So it was quite the chance to get to Bishop, but it was a long day, and I planned to get up early. So I started scouting the night before with maps where it was going to go.
Well, guys, being unfamiliar with the Bishop area, um, I decided to try to scout on my own, um, looking for a likely place. Excuse my shadow in the photo. And I drove out of town looking for some foothills like that I could put in my pictures, some distant scenes like that. Um, and I came up with this location. Down there you can see my digital SLR setup. I'm basically trying to put some foreground in the pictures. You can see it right there. And anyway, there's my trusty steed for getting me here. Again, I got in here pretty late last night after a long drive and tried to figure out where to come. I always try to get out in the foothills of the mountains so that there's some, shape that I can use. I got up at 4:30 in the morning, and it was already throwing early morning light. So tomorrow morning, I'm afraid I'm going to have to get up like 3:30 in the morning to be in position. I'm scouting today. Pretty happy with the first few pictures I got with the illumination on the mountains. Wish we had clouds. Hey, landscape photography is quite the challenge sometimes. But what a beautiful spot. I've dreamed of my whole life of being based out of Bishop here for a few days, doing what I'm doing.
One of the keys that helped me get some of the photos on this trip that I'd like to discuss briefly is shooting bracketed exposures and combining them together to make HDR photos. HDR allows you to capture the highlights in the shadows, more color gradations, more detail, and you preserve both the highlights and the shadows, and you end up with much greater dynamic range, more color rendition, and more detail in the overall capture. I found with my cameras, I have a Z9 and a Nikon D750, that for me, just using one stop over, one stop under the neutral frame is the very best for me. On my cameras, if I try to use 5 exposures, in other words, all one stop apart, a lot of times it slows me down when it gets to the very slow shutter speeds and with no benefit. A lot of times with just the 3 bracketed exposures, one over, one neutral, and one under, I can even handhold an HDR. Otherwise, I use a tripod, and a lot of times I don't want to use a remote release because the wind is blowing in my landscape settings. So what I'll do is set the bracketed exposures and then set up a delay of a few seconds before the first exposure takes place. And that allows me to activate the camera, and then those vibrations die down. And it's not perfect in every situation, but I found if I just do the 3, that I can really get amazing dynamic range, much greater than I can with just a single exposure. And that's been a key to some of the photos that I've captured, particularly in very low light. That being said, it's very easy to get carried away and make the photos look garish, totally unrealistic. And I was an early adapter at some of the specialized HDR programs like Aurora and programs like that. But now I just really use HDR as just kind of a way to extend the highlights and the shadows. And it really does give a much better result. In the sequence that I have here, you'll see in the film strip I have 3 bracketed exposures selected. And then I take those and combine them together into one HDR. If you're doing just an HDR photograph, you can select various deghosting amounts, and the deghosting amounts will allow you to remove some of the details that might be overlapping or blurred. It'll choose the sharpest and use that. If you do HDR panoramas, which I've done quite a bit of, you lose that deghosting feature. I found for a workflow, sometimes I'm better off to make a series of HDR photos and then combine them later into a one HDR panorama. And of course, you're shooting in RAW. The HDR is produced in what's a DNG, digital negative format, and then you can combine the different photos together into a panorama. And in Lightroom, there's some very flexible, good ways to do that. You can really bring out a lot of color just by moving sliders or a few clicks. I both use the Develop module in Lightroom and the Camera Raw module in Photoshop. I generally prefer to work in Photoshop because I have filters that I can use that can highlight some of the details, and some of those are immensely powerful. I use Topaz. I have used Skylum's products. Right now, pretty much all I use is Topaz and the Nick collection. So there are some really good options that I have working in the Photoshop space that I prefer because I can go back and, fade amount of effect that I put on with a filter. That's much easier, much more easily done in Photoshop than it is in Lightroom. But that's been kind of the key to get these impossible pictures. One of my favorite pictures is the moon down the Owens Valley, and the valley itself was pretty well dark, but I was able to capture the whole scene using HDR.